Even though America's military budget is bigger than the next 10 countries combined, it's apparently not enough for presidential hopeful Mitt Romney. The presidential Republican nominee recently said that America needs to grow its military and maintain it as an incomparable force of military domination in the world. So is the world really as unsafe as newly minted Mitt would have you think? Well, to talk about this, I'm joined by David Swanson, campaigner for Roots Action. David, in a recent campaign speech, Mitt was saying, the world isn't safe. We really need to bolster our military. What do you think about that statement?
Well, I'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who was claiming that the world was perfectly safe, so it's not clear who Mitt is going up against there. I think he's won that one pretty easily. But as far as building the biggest military the world's ever seen, what can I say except mission accomplished? It's done. We've got it. The military has grown every year that George W. Bush or Barack Obama has been president, and it is the biggest military we've ever seen. So it's not clear. There aren't any specifics from that Romney speech about how or whether it would be any bigger than it is now. The dangerous elements in that speech, of course, are that he falsely claims Iran is developing nuclear weapons to give to terrorists. There's no evidence. Our Secretary of so-called Defense says otherwise. And he lumps a bunch of nations into a new package of enemies, including Russia, China, Venezuela, Pakistan, and of course, Iran.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of strong rhetoric in that speech, David. And you're right, the military has been bolstered continuously, exponentially since 9/11, doubled since 9/11, in fact. And Obama is pretty much a war president. So what do you think that Mitt, is this really all he has to go on, that he just has to make the distinction, I'm a stronger war president than the current war president?
Well, I think in doing that, he guarantees himself a large majority of veterans' votes, if not active duty, of probably white male votes and warmonger votes in general, because he just has to be a little bit worse than Obama. For the same reason, there are well-meaning liberals who will vote for Obama because Romney will promise something worse, no matter how bad Obama gets. So they just have to distinguish themselves in some way. The dangerous thing about it, though, is that Obama is enlarging the military and giving it greater secretive, privatized, abusive powers, and Romney wants to outdo him. And so Romney has to push it further. And we don't know how big or how outrageous his military would be. He claims that making the military bigger makes us safer and makes for fewer wars. Whereas all the evidence of the past 51 years since Eisenhower warned us about the power of a military-industrial complex is exactly the opposite. The bigger the military, the more momentum for wars, the more planning for wars, the more creation of wars.
Well, David, where does this end? It just seems like these candidates are just going to keep expanding the military, pressing on these threats from all around the world. You just said yourself that they present us with this false dichotomy that we have to choose between two war presidents because one is going to be a bigger war president. We're kind of scared to see where he might take the country. What do you think, that this is a setup so we can continue the wars endlessly? There's really no other option. And you're right, a lot of people do choose for the less of two evils, let's say.
Yeah, personally, I'm inclined not to choose evil, but both of these parties are sold out to the weapons makers and the other war profiteers and answer to them before they answer to the American people. 3/4 of us want out of Afghanistan. Large majorities of us want military spending cut back, and the more people are informed, the more they believe that. We don't have that candidate in those two parties, and so my recommendation, as always, is to put 95% or more of our effort and resources into building an activist movement to fix this problem, regardless of who's in the White House, and then go vote your conscience.
David, I wanted to play a clip really quickly from that speech in San Diego of Mitt. Go ahead and roll that.
We have two courses we could follow. One is to follow in the pathway of Europe, to shrink our military smaller and smaller to pay for our social needs. And they, of course, rely upon the strength of America, and they hope for the best. Were we to follow that kind of course, there'd be no one that could stand to protect us. The other is to commit to preserve America as the strongest military in the world, second to none, with no comparable power anywhere in the world.
It seems like in that speech, I mean, people are booing when he's saying cut the military to pay for social services. I mean, that's not happening. And instead, the Pentagon is bolstering the military and cutting social services time and time again. I mean, do you think that this is also a false dilemma that we're presented with, that if we cut the military, somehow our country will be weak? And what do you think about what he said right there?
Well, I think it's refreshing to have military spending and the costs of human needs spending paired together, even though he's on the opposite side from what I am. That is the choice before us, and it is a choice where Europe and other parts of the world have gone a different direction. It's not clear that the United States military is protecting Europe. On the contrary, we seem to be making a target for terrorists out of Europe, offending the people of Europe, keeping nuclear weapons illegally in non-nuclear European states, and so forth. I think that there is a lesson to be found in the fact that the United States is number 38 in life expectancy, and so on through all the categories of well-being in our society. That's what that crowd is cheering for, running down our society for the sake of building up weapons that we do not need. There is not evidence that we would not be better off following that European route.
Do you think at this point, David, I mean, you said that he speaks a lot about Iran, even Russia, China. I mean, he's mentioning all these countries that, I mean, do you think that this is harmful rhetoric to stand behind, to say that we need to be constantly on the offense?
I think it's incredibly dangerous. I think this is how the military-industrial complex works. It puts money and momentum behind war plans and neglects alternatives to war, and we end up looking at a choice between war or nothing. But it's not just Romney. I mean, within the past couple of weeks, we've heard the Prime Minister of Russia talking about the possibility of war, offended by the bases being set up along the border of Russia in Eastern Europe. We haven't heard this kind of talk in a long time, and it's not just the result of Mitt Romney campaigning. It's also the result of missile so-called defense bases being built. So we have a problem, but it pervades both of these parties.
Thanks so much for joining us, David. That was David Swanson, campaigner for Roots Action.